The coin made a flat, final sound on the raw pine of the desk, a small brass sun that held no warmth at all. Abner watched it spin down, a brief, dizzying dance before it settled, heads up, mocking him with its promise of liberty. Mr. Davies, the land agent, did not watch the coin. His gaze was fixed on the ledger before him, his finger tracing a line of fresh ink that had just sliced Abner's life in two. The man's face was a mask of administrative patience, a careful arrangement of features that conveyed regret without feeling it. He had the clean, soft hands of someone who never had to turn soil or fight the elements for his daily bread, only shuffle papers that did the fighting for him. The new survey lines, he had explained, were precise, legal, and absolute. Abner's small, fertile plot, the one he and his wife had poured 2 decades of their lives into, the one that held her memory in every furrow, was no longer his. It now belonged to a syndicate from the East, a name on a piece of paper with more power than a lifetime of sweat. What was left for him was the parcel nobody wanted, a windswept shelf of rock and thin soil at the far edge of the territory, a place considered little more than a geological afterthought. "It's all accounted for," Mr. Davies said, his voice as dry as dust. "The acreage is comparable." As per the ordinance, he slid the new deed across the desk, a crisp document that felt like an insult. Abner didn't touch it. He looked past the man, through the single window of the small office, at the town he no longer fully belonged to. He could see the general store, the smithy, the small church where he had buried his Martha just a year prior. He was now an island, and the tide was going out. The law was the law, Davies had said. And the law had decided he was to be moved to the place where things went to be forgotten. The walk to the edge of town was a slow, heavy procession of one. He carried nothing but the deed in his pocket and a small canvas sack with his remaining provisions. He didn't look at the faces he passed, he knew what he would see. Pity, in the best of them. A flicker of satisfaction in the others, the ones who had always coveted his well-tended land. He was old, a widower with no children to stand for him, an easy piece to move off the board. When he finally reached the plot, the wind hit him as if it had been waiting. It was a constant, scouring force that had stripped the land of anything loose or gentle. The soil was a thin, gravelly skin over a hard pan of rock and pale earth. A few stubborn, twisted shrubs clung to life, their branches permanently bent in a posture of surrender to the prevailing gale. This was not a place to grow things. It was a place to be eroded, to be worn down to nothing, particle by particle, day by day. He sat on a rock, the same cold stone that was the land's most plentiful crop, and felt the full weight of his solitude pressed down. Martha was gone. His home was gone. His purpose was gone. He was a man with a hammer and no nail, a sower with no seed for this barren ground. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. What he had in his sack would last a month, maybe 2 if he was careful. After that, the equation would solve for 0. He felt a despair so profound it was almost quiet, a hollow space opening up inside him where his future used to be. He was on the scrap heap, and the world had turned its back to walk away. He spent the first day in a state of muted shock, doing nothing but walking the perimeter of his new, useless world. He paced the boundary markers, his boots scuffing against stone and grit, as if trying to understand the physical dimensions of his own failure. The land was a sentence, and he was serving it. By evening, the chill had set in, a deep, penetrating cold that the wind drove into his bones. He built a small fire with the driest bits of scrub he could find, the flames whipping and dancing erratically, offering little comfort. He ate a handful of dried beans, chewing them slowly, mechanically. As darkness fell, the emptiness of the landscape became absolute. There were no lights, no sounds of life from the town, only the ceaseless howl of the wind and the vast, indifferent blanket of stars. He lay wrapped in his thin bedroll, his back against the cold slab of a large rock outcropping that offered the only real shelter on the entire plot. He did not sleep. He listened to the wind, that great voice of oblivion, and for the first time, he felt a genuine, terrifying kinship with it. It was tearing the world apart, and he was coming apart with it. He thought of Martha, of her hands in the garden, of the smell of baking bread that used to fill their small cabin. The memory was so sharp, so painful, it was like a physical blow. That was a life that belonged to someone else now. The man who had lived it was gone, and he, this new, diminished creature, was left in his place. He was at the bottom, the very foundation of loss. There was nowhere further to fall. And as the night wore on, a strange thing happened. The despair did not lessen, but it settled. It became a solid thing he could feel, a weight he could measure. And against that weight, a tiny, stubborn spark of defiance began to glow. The next morning, driven by a flicker of instinct rather than hope, he began to dig. He didn't know why, only that the act of moving earth was the one thing he knew how to do. He chose a spot at the base of the rock outcropping, where the ground was most sheltered from the wind. The topsoil was just as he expected, thin, rocky, and useless, a mere dusting of brown over a pale, unyielding substrate. He worked for hours, his shovel grating against stone, his shoulders and back screaming in protest. The pile of discarded dirt grew slowly. The townspeople, if they bothered to look this far, would see an old man pointlessly digging a hole on a worthless piece of land. They would shake their heads, perhaps with a sad chuckle. Let them. He wasn't digging for them. He was digging for himself, searching for something, anything, beneath the surface of his ruin. Then, about 3 feet down, the sound changed. The grating scrape of metal on rock was replaced by a soft, heavy thud. He drove the shovel in again, and it slid into the ground with a satisfying weight. He pulled out a spadeful of earth unlike the rest. It was dense, smooth, and a rich, ochre color. He dropped to his knees, crumbling it in his hands. It was clay. Not just any clay, but a deep, pure deposit of it, cool and pliable to the touch. He dug faster, his exhaustion forgotten, his heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more practical. It was a resource. He kept digging, revealing a thick, wide vein of the stuff, protected and preserved by the very rock and wind that made the surface so inhospitable. The land's curse was also its secret gift. He stood up, looking at the hole, then at the towering rock face beside it. The wind howled over the top, but down here, in the deepening pit, it was calm. An idea began to form, a structure taking shape in his mind. It was a mad idea, an old man's folly, but it was his. He would not grow things on this land. He would build. He would take the earth itself, the very substance of his exile, and he would turn it into a source of warmth. The work became his entire world. Each day before dawn, he would rise, his body a symphony of aches, and begin the slow, methodical process of creation. He was no potter, no mason, but he understood the logic of materials, the quiet conversation between earth and effort. He dug the clay, bucket by painstaking bucket, hauling it out of the pit that was slowly becoming the foundation of his new life. He mixed it with sand he gathered from a dry wash a mile away and tough, fibrous grasses he cut from the base of the shrubs. He worked the mixture with his bare feet, stomping and turning it until it had the right consistency, a thick, uniform mud that clung to his skin. His hands, already calloused from a lifetime of labor, grew tougher still, the skin cracking and healing in a repeating cycle of injury and repair. He fashioned a simple wooden mold and began to form bricks, hundreds of them, laying them out in long, neat rows to bake in the pale sun. Each brick was a small, tangible victory against the formlessness of his despair. While they dried, he excavated further, carving a space directly into the earth at the base of the great rock. He was not building on the land, he was building in it, using the planet's own mass as insulation. The design was in his head, a simple, ancient thing. A low, domed chamber, a heavy stone for a door, and a flue that would draw the smoke up and away along the face of the rock. He found flat stones for the floor and the flue, splitting them with a hammer and chisel, the sharp crack of the impact echoing in the otherwise silent basin. The mocking voices from the town were a distant memory, replaced by the rhythm of his own labor, the thud of the shovel, the slap of wet clay, the ring of steel on stone. He was building more than an oven. He was building a system, a machine for living. The rock would absorb and hold the heat. The earth would insulate it. The wind, his tormentor, would be defeated by solid mass, by a structure that did not fight it but simply ignored it. The day he went into town for supplies was a trial. He needed flour, salt, and yeast, the essential components for the next stage of his plan. Walking into Finch's mercantile was like stepping into another world, one of conversation, commerce, and casual judgment. The air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and smoked meat, a universe away from the clean, harsh scent of wind and clay. Mr. Finch, a man whose ledger was his Bible, watched Abner approach the counter, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the clay caked under Abner's nails, the gauntness of his face, the sheer, stubborn set of his jaw. "Abner," he said, his tone a careful mixture of courtesy and suspicion. "Need some provisions?" Abner nodded, placing his small list on the counter. Finch read it, and his eyebrows went up. 5 sacks of flour? That's a considerable amount. Planning on a long winter out on that rock pile? His voice was just loud enough for others in the store to hear. Rowan, a man who had never done a day of hard labor he could avoid, let out a short, derisive laugh. "What's he gonna do with all that, Finch? Bake for the coyotes?" The other men chuckled. Abner did not react. He looked directly at Finch, his gaze steady. "I'll pay cash," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He laid the coins on the counter, the last of his money from the sale of his old farm's equipment. The metallic sound cut through the low laughter. There was a moment of silence. Finch, the businessman above all, recognized the finality in the gesture. This was not a plea for credit, it was a transaction. He grunted, his expression unreadable, and began to measure out the flour. Abner loaded the sacks onto a handcart he'd borrowed, the weight a welcome, solid burden. He did not acknowledge the stares that followed him out the door. He had what he came for. Their mockery was just noise, another kind of wind. It could not touch the solid thing he was building. He was turning his back on their world of words and opinions and returning to his world of stone and clay and fire. His days settled into a new and demanding rhythm, a liturgy of survival. The first task was always fire. He would gather dry brush and wood, the fuel for his creation, and carefully lay it inside the oven's dark mouth. The first spark, coaxed from flint and steel into a nest of dry tinder, was a daily miracle, a small rebellion against the cold. As the fire grew, filling the clay dome with roaring heat, he would mix the dough. His hands, clumsy at first, became deft and knowing, working the flour, water, salt, and yeast into a living, breathing mass. He learned the feel of it, the exact moment when it was ready, elastic and smooth. He would let it rise in a warm corner of the small dugout shelter he had built for himself next to the oven, a space warmed by the radiating heat that bled slowly through the thick clay walls. The entire structure was a single, integrated system. The rock was the anchor, the oven was the engine, and his small shelter was the beneficiary. After several hours, when the oven's walls glowed with stored energy, he would rake out the coals and ash, swab the stone floor clean with a damp cloth on a stick, and slide the loaves inside. He would seal the entrance with the heavy, tight-fitting stone door, and then he would wait. This was the quietest part of the day, a time of trust in his own creation. He would sit and watch his few chickens peck at the ground, their simple, unquestioning existence a comfort. Then, the smell would begin, a rich, nutty aroma that filled his small world, a scent of life and sustenance where there had been only dust and rock. He baked every day, perfecting his craft. The loaves came out with thick, dark crusts and soft, airy interiors. He was not just making food, he was converting labor and foresight into security, loaf by loaf. He stacked them on cool shelves in his dugout, a growing wall of provision, a fortress against the coming winter. The first sign of the storm was a change in the quality of the light. The sky, usually a vast, clear blue, took on a milky, bruised look, and the wind, his constant companion, fell eerily silent. The air grew heavy, pregnant with a cold that felt different, ancient and predatory. Abner felt it in his bones. He secured the chickens in their small coop, checked the seal on his oven door, and brought in an extra supply of fuel. He had enough bread to last for months, enough water stored in a covered barrel. His system was ready. The storm did not arrive, it descended. It came not as individual snowflakes but as a solid wall of white, a furious, blinding curtain that erased the world. The wind returned with a vengeance, not as a directional force but as a chaotic, screaming maelstrom from all directions at once. The temperature plummeted. Any living thing caught out in this would be scoured, frozen, and buried in minutes. Inside his dugout, the world was transformed. The roar of the blizzard was a muted, distant thunder, the sound of a battle being fought far away. The thick earth walls and the massive rock face absorbed the violence, leaving him in a pocket of profound stillness. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the embers in his hearth and the sound of his own breathing. The residual heat from the day's baking kept the small space not just survivable, but comfortable. He ate a piece of his bread, the sturdy crust yielding to a soft, warm crumb. Outside, nature was unleashing a torrent of lethal power, an expression of pure, indifferent chaos. Inside, there was order, warmth, and sustenance. He had built a buffer between himself and oblivion, a small, stubborn island of life in a sea of death. He was not just surviving the storm, he was living through it, calmly and deliberately, a testament to the quiet power of a well-laid plan and hands willing to execute it. The world outside had become a tomb, but his small, earthen shelter was a womb. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist beyond his door. The snow piled up, burying his shelter completely, turning his small window into a wall of solid white. The only connection to the outside was the flue, which he had to periodically clear with a long pole to keep the air flowing. He moved with a calm economy of motion, his routine a bulwark against the potential for panic. He fed his chickens, ate his bread, and tended the small fire he kept for light and auxiliary warmth. He was utterly alone, but he did not feel lonely. He felt a deep sense of rightness, of a thing built for a purpose now fulfilling it perfectly. On the 4th day, he was jolted from his quiet routine by a frantic, muffled pounding. It was not the sound of the wind. It was coming from his door. He took a heavy bar of wood and braced himself, unlatching the heavy plank door. It swung inward, followed by a cascade of snow and a figure that collapsed onto the floor, a ghost caked in ice and driven by desperation. Abner dragged the man inside and shut the door against the howling wight. As he brushed the snow from the man's face, he recognized him. It was Rowan, the man from the mercantile, the one who had laughed at him. His face was a mask of frostbite and terror, his lips blue and cracked. "Help," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "My family, no food, no wood." He had seen the faint wisp of smoke from Abner's flue during a brief lull in the storm and had gambled everything on reaching it. It was a journey that should have killed him. Now he was here, a frozen supplicant at the feet of the man he had ridiculed. The moral arithmetic was stark. Abner could let him freeze. It would be justice, of a sort. The world was full of that kind of justice. But his system was not built on revenge, it was built on surplus. He had warmth to spare. He had food in abundance. To deny it would be to violate the very principles of foresight and provision he had lived by. It was not a question of forgiveness, but of capacity. He had enough. Therefore, he could give. He wrapped Rowan in a heavy blanket and placed a mug of warm water in his trembling hands. Then he cut a thick slice of bread and handed it to him. Rowan devoured the bread like a starving animal, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and shame. He had mocked the source of his own salvation. When he could speak again, he told Abner of the town's plight. The blizzard had been unprecedented, catching everyone unprepared. Roofs had collapsed. Livestock was lost. And now, the food was running out. The mercantile supplies were dwindling, and what was left was being hoarded. Families were cold, hungry, and terrified, trapped in their homes. Abner listened, his expression unchanging. He packed 2 large loaves of bread into a sack and gave them to Rowan. "For your family," he said. "There's a rope by the door. Tie it to yourself. It will give you a line to follow back. Come tomorrow if you can." Rowan could only nod, his gratitude too deep for words. He stumbled back out into the white chaos, no longer just a man, but a messenger, a bearer of impossible news, the old fool on the rock pile had bred. The next day, they came. Not just Rowan, but Mr. Finch himself, leading a small, exhausted party of men roped together against the storm. The store owner, a man defined by pragmatism and profit, looked at Abner's setup with a stunned expression. He saw the oven, now covered in a thick blanket of insulating snow. He saw the neat stacks of bread in the warm, dry dugout. He saw a system, elegant and effective, where he and everyone else had seen only a wasteland and an old man's folly. "Abner," Finch said, his voice stripped of all its usual arrogance. "We were wrong. We need to buy your bread. We'll pay anything." "Name your price." Abner looked at the desperate faces of the men, their breath pluming in the cold air of his shelter. He shook his head slowly. "It's not for sale," he said. A flicker of fear crossed Finch's face. But Abner continued, his voice even. "But you can have it. Bring what you can trade later. Firewood. Salt. Anything you can spare when this is over. For now, just take what you need to feed your people." He began handing them the loaves, each one a solid, weighty promise. The transaction was no longer about money, it was about community, about the shared, desperate business of staying alive. The mockers had become dependents. The outcast had become the provider. His vindication was not in their apology, but in the simple, undeniable fact of the bread in their hands.